to our democracy and security from multiple adversaries in these domains. A few words first about our guest. Senator Warner had a very successful career in technology and in business before he went on to serve as Virginia's governor from 2002 to 2006, my home state. He was elected to the Senate in 2008, and he's now in his second term. He is on Senate Finance, Banking, and Budget and the Rules Committees, but he is probably best known these days for being vice chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The SISI, as you know, implications for our democracy and our security, and it's been releasing regular reports that have been very impactful. I've had the honor and privilege of being a regular guest of the committee, and I want to take this opportunity to commend the leadership of Vice Chairman Warner and Chairman Burr and their colleagues on the committee for their thoroughness, for the bipartisan spirit with which they've conducted their work, and for their unwavering commitment to protect America. I want to thank you. These issues are also front and center for the Center on New American Security here. In 2019, we intend to launch a major project on countering high-tech illiberalism, focusing on all the ways that autocratic regimes are using technology to challenge free, open societies and to corrode democracy from the inside, and addressing, we hope, many of the issues that Senator Warner will raise today. We will partner with industry, academia, and the policy community to develop strategies to sharpen America's strategic edge and that of our allies to deter and defeat these threats. After our remarks, if we have some time, the Senator will take a few questions. Senator has to depart. I hope some of you will stay around. We're going to have our CNES experts comment on the speech and give their views on where we go next. So with that, we are delighted to have Senator Warner with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Let me get mic'd up here. I apologize about being a little bit late. I can unambiguously say that when I was governor, there was a lot less traffic. Great. Are we on? All right? Great, guys. Okay, let me throw this over here. Normally I wing these, but I got a lot to say this morning, and I want to thank, first of all, the Center for New American Security. I want to thank Victoria, who we have had a chance to get to know and respect, and appreciate your leadership here. Mr. Fontaine, it's great to see you. I know Eli Ratner was involved in putting this event together as well. And this really is, I share with what Victoria said, I think one of the most urgent challenges of our time. The use of cyber warfare by our adversaries and the need for us in the United States to articulate a clear and thoughtful U.S. cyber doctrine. Now, a little unusual that we're doing this today on December 7th, which is obviously an auspicious date in our history. We remember Pearl Harbor as the first foreign attack on U.S. soil in modern history. Unfortunately, we also remember Pearl Harbor as a major intelligence failure. As Vice Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I've spent the better part of the last 2 years on an investigation connected to America's most recent intelligence failure, which was also a failure of imagination, a failure to identify Russia's broader strategy to interfere in our elections. Our federal government and institutions were caught flat-footed in 2016, and our social media companies failed to anticipate how their platforms could be manipulated and misused by Russian operatives. Frankly, we should have seen it coming. Over the last 2 decades, adversary nations, like Russia, have developed a radically different conception of information security, one that spans cyber warfare and information operations. I fear that we've entered a new era of nation-state conflict, one in which a nation projects strength less through traditional military hardware and more through cyber and information warfare. For better part of 2 decades, this was a domain where we thought in the United States we had unparalleled superiority. The thinking was our cyber capabilities were unmatched. Our supposed superiority allowed us to write the rules. This confidence appears to have blinded us on 3 important developments. First, we are under attack, and candidly, we have been under attack for many years. Our adversaries and their proxies are carrying out cyber attacks at every level of our society. We've seen state-sponsored or sanctioned attacks on our healthcare systems, energy infrastructure, and our financial system. We are witnessing constant intrusions into our federal networks. We are seeing regular attempts to access parts of our critical infrastructure and hold them ransom. Last year, we saw global ransomware attacks increase by 93%. Denial of service attacks increased by 91%. According to some estimates, cyber attacks and cybercrime account for up to $175 billion in economic and intellectual property loss in North America alone. Globally, the estimates are closer to $600 billion. And typically, our adversaries aren't even using their most cyber tools. They are attacking opportunistically, using phishing techniques, and figuratively rattling unlocked doors. This has all been happening under our noses. The effects have been devastating, yet the attackers have faced few, if any, consequences. Second, in many ways, we brought this on ourselves. We live in a society that is becoming more and more dependent on products and networks that are under constant attack. Yet the level of security we accept in commercial technology products is unacceptably low, particularly when it comes to the growing Internet of Things. The problem is only compounded by our failure to promote appropriate cyber hygiene. It's an outrage that more digital services, from email to online banking, don't come up with default 2-factor authentication. And it's totally unacceptable that large enterprises, including federal agencies, aren't using the available tools of defense. Lastly, we have failed to recognize that our adversaries are working from a totally different playbook. Countries like Russia are increasingly merging traditional cyber attacks with information operations. This emerging brand of hybrid cyber warfare exploits our greatest strengths, our openness and free flow of ideas. And unfortunately, we're just now waking up to that fact. Looking back, the signs have been pretty obvious. 20 years ago, Sergei Lavrov, then serving as Russia's UN ambassador, advanced a draft resolution at the United Nations dealing with cyber and, quote, prohibiting particular dangerous forms of information operations. Now, we can debate the sincerity of Russia's draft resolution, but in hindsight, the premise of this resolution is striking. Specifically, the Russians saw traditional cyber warfare and cyber espionage interlinked with information operations. It's true that as recently as 2016, in the Russia operation there, the cyber operations, the hacking of the DNC and the Podesta emails, was carried out with one vector, and the misinformation and IRA activities were on a separate tracks. But there's no doubt that Putin and his leaderships now sees the full potential of marrying these cyber operations. By contrast, our country spent 2 decades treating information operations and traditional information security as distinct domains. And increasingly, we treated info operations as quaint and frankly outmoded. Just a year after Lavrov introduced the resolution, the United States eliminated the United States Information Agency, relegating counter-propaganda and information operations to a lower tier of foreign policy. In the 2 decades that followed, the U.S. embraced the Internet resolution as inherently democratizing, but we ignored the warning signs outside the bubble of Western democracies. The naivete of U.S. policymakers extended not just to Russia, but to China as well. Recall when President Clinton warned China that attempts to police the Internet would be, quote, like nailing Jell-O to the wall. In fact, China instead has been wildly successful at harnessing the economic benefits of the Internet in the absence of political freedom. China's doctrine of cyber sovereignty is the idea that a state has the absolute right to control information within its border. This takes the form of censorship, disinformation, and social control. It also takes the form of traditional computer network exploitation. And China has developed a powerful cyber and information affairs bureaucracy with broad authority to enforce their doctrine. We see indications of the Chinese approach in their successful efforts to recruit Western companies to their information control efforts. It's pretty amazing to me that Google is actually looking to work with China to develop a censored version of its search engine in China. Today, China's cyber and censorship infrastructure is the envy of authoritarian regimes around the world. China is now exploiting both its technology and its cyber sovereignty doctrine to countries like Venezuela, Ethiopia, and Pakistan. With the export of these tools and ideas, and with countries like North Korea and Iran copying Russia's disinformation playbook, these challenges will only get worse. And yet, as a nation, we basically remain complacent. Now, despite a flurry of strategy documents from the White House and DOD, the federal government is still not sufficiently organized or resourced to tackle this hybrid threat. We have no White House cyber czar, no cyber bureau, or senior cyber coordinator at the State Department. And we still have insufficient capacity at both state and DHS when it comes to both cybersecurity and disinformation. Our Global Engagement Center at the State Department is not sufficiently equipped to counter propaganda from our adversaries. And the White House has still not clarified the roles and responsibilities for cyber across the whole expanse of USG. While some in the private sector have begun to grapple with these challenges, many more remain resistant to changes. And the American people are still not fully aware and cognizant of the threat. And they've not internalized the lessons of the last few years. We have a long way to go on cyber hygiene and online media consumption habits. Let me be clear. Congress as well does not have its act together. We have no cyber committee. Cyber cuts across numerous committee jurisdictions, frequently hindering our ability to get ahead of the problem. And it's even worse in the area of misinformation and disinformation. And the dangers are only growing as new technologies, such as deep fakes, where audio and video manipulation can literally put words in the mouth of an elected official, a business leader, or any other leader, and these efforts are now being commercialized. The truth is, we all know as a nation, we are becoming ever more dependent on software. But at the same time, we are treating cybersecurity, network resiliency, and data reliability as afterthoughts. And these vulnerabilities will only continue to grow as our so-called real economy becomes increasingly inseparable from our digital economy. If we're going to turn this around, we need not just a whole-of-government approach, but we need a whole-of-society cyber doctrine. So what would a U.S. cyber doctrine look like? It's not enough to simply improve the security of our infrastructure, computer systems, and data. We must also deal with adversaries who are using American technologies to exploit our freedom, our openness, and basically attack our most important asset, our democracy. So let me modestly lay out 5 recommendations. First, we need to develop new rules and norms for the use of cyber and information operations. And we need to better enforce existing norms. And most importantly, we cannot do this alone. We need to do this on an international scale. We need to develop shared strategies with our allies that will strengthen these norms. And when possible, we need to get our adversaries to buy into these norms as well. Our adversaries continue to believe that there won't be consequences for their actions. Now, we all know in the post-9/11 national security environment, we spent tremendous energy combating terrorism and rogue states, and that was appropriate. But frankly, we've allowed some of our near-peer adversaries to operate with relative immunity when they attack the United States in the digital domain. There have been some reports in the press about the United States supposedly pushing back at second-tier adversaries on occasion. And some of these items we all know about. But we've, frankly, largely avoided this with Russia and China out of a fear of a cyber escalation. I think we all would recognize if through cyber tools somehow Moscow got shut down for 24 hours, it would be a problem. But if someone shut down New York for 24 hours, it would be a global crisis. And as a result, for China and Russia, it's pretty much been open season in terms of their attacks against the United States. This has to come to a conclusion. We need a national conversation about defensive and offensive tools we are willing to use to respond to the ongoing threats we face. In short, we need to start holding our adversaries accountable. Failing to articulate a clear set of expectations about when and where we will respond to cyber attacks is not just bad policy, it's downright dangerous. We are allowing other nations to write the playbook on cyber norms. Part of this is a result of U.S. inaction. From the late 90s into the early 2000s, the U.S. was a consistent dissenting voice at the UN where meetings on cyber norms were proposed. In part, this reflected our aversion to piecemeal approaches to cybersecurity, but it also reflected a view that we didn't want, as America, to be bound by lesser nations. In 2015, there was a major effort at the UN, including the United States in this case, to agree to principles of state behavior in cyberspace. We saw some international consensus around protecting critical infrastructure and investigating and mitigating cybercrime. Unfortunately, these 2015 principles at the UN failed to address economic espionage. And even the short-lived 2015 U.S.-China cyber espionage deal was insufficient. And in 2017, disagreements between the U.S., China, and Russia led to a deadlock on the question of how international law should apply to cyber conflicts. And let's acknowledge, since that time, little progress has been made. Now, it's been true that some folks in the private sector and the NGO space have stepped up. Look at Microsoft's Digital Geneva Convention. Look at the recent Paris call for trust and security in cyberspace that was signed by 57 nations, but not the United States. This is another example of the United States stepping back on the world stage and allowing countries like France to fill the void. Recently, the U.S. government and the State Department in particular have renewed efforts to advance norms and norms discussion. The efforts must be elevated and strengthened. But norms on traditional cyber attacks alone are not enough. We also need to bring information operations into the debate. This includes building support for rules that address the Internet's potential for censorship and repression. We need to present alternatives that explicitly embrace a free and open Internet. And we need that responsibility to extend not only to government, but to the private sector. We need multilateral agreements with key allies, just like we've done with international treaties on biological and chemical weapons. That discussion needs to address mutual defense commitments. We should be linking consensus principles of state behavior in cyberspace explicitly with deterrence and enforcement doctrines. U.S. policymakers with allies should predetermine responses for potential targets, perpetrators, and severity of attack. That means clearly and publicly linking actions and countermeasures to specific provocations. That could mean sanctions, export controls, or indictments. It could even include military action or other responses. Now, we should be realistic, though, about the limits of norms in shaping behavior. Let's not kid ourselves. At least in the short run, nations like Russia that routinely ignore global norms is not going to make an about-face in the cyber domain. But this should not deter us. It should give us simply a more realistic set of expectations for how quickly we can expect to see results. But the stronger we make the alliances, the more teeth we can apply to these norms, the more countries we can recruit to them, the more effective the efforts will be at disciplining the behaviors of Russia, China, and other similar adversaries. My second recommendation is we need a society-wide effort to combat misinformation and disinformation, particularly on social media. My eyes were opened to this through the Intel Committee's investigation on the Russian incursion. Everyone on the committee, Democrat and Republican alike, agrees that the linkage between cyber threats and disinformation is a serious challenge, especially on social media. And again, in some ways, this misuse and abuse of social media was a whole new world for the Intel community. It's now clear that foreign agents made social media to spread misinformation and hijack our civil discourse. Again, let's quickly recap. The Russian playbook in 2016 included cyber penetrations of our election infrastructure, hacks and weaponizing of leaked information, amplification of divisive messages via social media, traditional overt propaganda, funding and supporting extreme candidates or parties, and misinformation, disinformation, and the real thing in terms of fake news. The goal was and is to undermine our faith in facts, our faith in the news media, and our faith in the democratic process. The truth is, none of this ended. This is an ongoing threat, and not just to the United States. We've also seen these tools used against all Western democracies. We've seen them used to incite racial and ethnic violence in countries like Myanmar. This threat is particularly serious in countries with low media literacy. In many ways, in those countries, media is the internet. So what do? How do we combat this threat? We can start by recognizing that this is truly a global problem. A 21st century cyber and misinformation doctrine should lean more into our alliances and other allies who share our values. Earlier this year, Senator Rubio and I brought together a group of 12 parliamentarians from across our NATO allies, and every one of our NATO countries have indicated they have seen evidence of Russian intervention within either their election process or within their civil society. We brought parliamentarians together at the Atlantic Council. We've focused this meeting on combating Russian election interference. Now, the irony of the meeting date was that was the very same day that President Trump appeared on the international stage with President Putin, and we saw an American president kowtowing to a Russian leader. Meanwhile, we were working with our NATO allies to develop a roadmap for increased cooperation and information sharing to counter Russian cyber and misinformation, disinformation aggression. In many countries, the truth is, because they've experienced this for a longer period of time, these countries are further along in educating their populations about the threat of misinformation and disinformation. Last month, I met with the Prime Minister of Finland. As he put it, the Finns have been dealing with Russian disinformation and misinformation for well over 100 years. But Finland is one of the most resilient countries when it comes to countering this threat from its neighbor to the east. I asked why. I believe it's partially because of their whole of society approach. It relies on a free press that maintains trust through strong self-regulatory mechanisms and high journalistic standards. It places a limit on the use of social media platforms, particularly for the very young. They also have a vibrant digital civics initiative. Finland's approach also depends on a national leadership that stays true to its values, even in the midst of contested elections and its own brand of partisan politics. Here in the United States, it will take all the private sector, the government, including us in Congress, as well as the American people, to deal with this new and evolving threat. In terms of the private sector, the major platform companies like Twitter and Facebook, but also Reddit, YouTube, Tumblr, aren't doing nearly enough to prevent their platforms from becoming petri dishes for Russian disinformation and propaganda. I don't have an interest, let me be clear, in regulating these companies into oblivion or stopping innovation. But as these companies have grown from dorm room startups to huge media companies of the 20th, they have to acknowledge with that great power comes greater responsibility. I recall very vividly that immediately following the 2016 election, when I started to raise the question that we might have had Russian interference, Mr. Zuckerberg publicly ridiculed the idea that Russia had influenced the U.S. elections via a Facebook post that he basically said intervened was, quote, a pretty crazy idea. Now, I don't pretend to have all the solutions, but I expect these platforms to work with Congress so that together we can take steps to protect the integrity of our elections and civil discourse in the future. Now, companies like Facebook and Twitter have taken some helpful voluntary steps. We need to see much more from them and their peers. That's going to require investments in people and technology to help identify misinformation before it spreads widely. Now, I put forward a white paper with 20 ideas that lays out some of the policy proposals for addressing this. For example, I think we could all agree we need to start with greater transparency. I think that human beings to know when they're being contacted on social media whether that message is actually coming from a fellow human being or from a bot. There's nothing inherently wrong with machine-generated information coming to us, but we ought to have that knowledge. I've also put forward bipartisan legislation, the so-called Honest Ads Act, that would require greater transparency for online political advertising. I also believe we need a full-fledged debate on the fact that companies should have a duty to identify and ferret out inauthentic accounts. If someone says they're Mark posting from Alexandria, but it's actually Boris from St. Petersburg, we at least ought to have a geo when that post appears. We've also put forward some detailed ideas around how we look at platforms' responsibility, and I would acknowledge that Facebook acknowledged this responsibility to try to take down truly defamatory content. I think platforms also should give greater access to independent academics and other analysts studying social trends. In our paper, we also put forward a number of other ideas around privacy, price transparency, data portability, just the basic idea that if any American knew how much data was being collected, that would help increase our knowledge. The truth is, most Americans think these services are free. There is nothing free about the amount of information these companies collect about each of us and then use in the marketplace. Now, these ideas are intended to spark a discussion, and we desperately need social media companies' input. But we have to move quickly, and at some point, if they don't work with us, Congress will have to act on its own. One thing is clear. The wild, wild West days of social media are coming to an end. Third, we need to harden the security of our computer networks, weapon systems, and IoT devices. Many of the responsibilities for cyber and misinformation and disinformation will fall on the government. But our nation's strategic response must also include greater vigilance by the private sector, which, to tell the truth, has frequent efforts to improve the security of their products. For over a decade, the United States thought it could set a light touch standard for global data protection, basically avoiding legislation. And while, let me be the first, as a former business guy, I understand regulations can have costs. But what we've also learned in our country, inaction can also cause costs, as other jurisdictions leap ahead of us with more stringent privacy and data protections. We see this with the GDPR, where to adopt national reasonable data protection and privacy rules left the field open for candidly clunkier European rules. And these standards that were set by Europe are now being adopted by Brazil, India, and Kenya. More broadly, we need to think about a software liability regime that drives the market towards more secure development across the entire product lifecycle. But nowhere is the need for private responsibility greater than in the Internet of Things. General Ashley, director of the DIA, has described IoT and mobile devices as, quote, the most emerging cyber threat to our national security. As a first step, we should use the purchasing power of the federal government to require that IoT devices meet at least minimum security standards. And again, I have bipartisan legislation on this with Senator Cory Gardner. At least at the federal level, with federal dollars, we need to make sure that the devices we are patchable, need to make sure that they don't have hard-coded passwords changed, and we must make sure they meet standards that they're free of known vulnerabilities. On a broader level, beyond IoT, public companies should have at least one board member who understands and can model cyber risk. Another area I've been working on is trying to impose at least some level of penalties on companies like Equifax, who failed repeatedly to take the necessary steps to secure their systems from cyber intrusions. Unfortunately, even in areas where we could expect a higher level of security and cyber hygiene, we find some of these same problems. In October, a GAO report found that, quote, nearly our new weapon systems under development are vulnerable to cyber attack. Now, earlier this year, we successfully included language in the NDAA requiring vulnerability assessments for weapon systems, which hopefully will help correct this problem. And the Pentagon has recently taken steps to make cybersecurity a greater priority within the DoD. But frankly, we face serious workforce challenges as well in recruiting and retaining top cyber professionals in the government when they have such attractive offers in the private sector. Now, this is a good segue to my fourth recommendation, realigning some of our defense spending priorities. The state's military budget, and I'm proud to say I'm as pro-defense as anyone, recently was passed at $716 billion. The remarkable thing is, when we look at Russia, its budget, military-wise, is about $70 billion. The truth is, the United States is spending most of its money on conventional weapons and personnel. By contrast, Russia devotes a much greater portion of that much smaller budget to cyber and other tools of asymmetric warfare like misinformation. Russia has come to the realization, and some of this goes back to 2011, when the then chairman of the Russian equivalent of chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff laid out the Russian military doctrine for the 21st century, where they said Russia could not compete with the West in terms of tanks and trucks and ships and guns, but in the realm of cyber or misinformation or disinformation, they could compete. And the truth is, when it comes to cyber, misinformation, and disinformation, Russia is already our peer, and in the areas of misinformation and disinformation, I believe, is ahead of us. Truth is, if you look back at Russia's effectiveness and cost effectiveness, if you add up all that Russia spent interfering in our elections in 2016, all they spent in the French elections in 2017, and then add on their cost of spending in the Brexit election, and then add it all together, it's less than the cost of one new F-35 airplane. So the notion that this is a one-off example, this is both an effective methodology for Russia, and it's also remarkably cheap. The same is true with China. China spends more on its defense budget, and some of that's opaque. But estimates are that it spends around $200 billion. Again, spending a disproportionate amount on cyber and misinformation. And the frightening thing to me is the delta between what we spend on our defense budget and China spends, that $500 billion, China is investing in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G technology, and a whole host of other technologies in the 21st century technologies where China hopes not to simply be our peer, but to actually lead the world. Frankly, they are starting to outpace us in these investments by an orders of magnitude. We need to realize while we still can. We need to redirect some of our DoD spending towards cyber and, frankly, within other parts of our government, misinformation and disinformation. And at the same time, we need that Sputnik moment to make sure that we make the investments in 5G, AI, quantum, and other technologies to keep apace with China. The final point is that we desperately need strong federal and presidential leadership for any digital doctrine to be truly effective. Because it literally touches every aspect of our society, we need presidential leadership and a official to head the interagency process on this issue. It's true there are men and women within DoD and within other agencies working really hard to try to protect the United States from cyber attacks. And we made some good progress in 2018 security. But only the president can mobilize the whole of society strategy we need. Now, I do want to acknowledge some positive steps, even by this administration, have been taken in recent months. The White House and DoD have released two important documents on cyber strategy that move us in the right direction. I also welcome the delegation of authorities to defend and deter cyber attacks below the presidential level. This will allow for quicker responses and greater interagency coordination. But again, these actions alone are inadequate. In the most recent NDAA, Congress attempted to establish a more aggressive posture on U.S. cybersecurity policy. This includes the potential use of offensive cyber capabilities to deter and respond to cyber attacks against U.S. interests, as well as authorization that info operations. It also grants the President authority to direct Cyber Command to respond and deter, to quote, an active and systematic and ongoing campaign attacks carried out by countries like Russia, China, North Korea. These powers, if used correctly, are important components of cyber doctrine, but by definition, they require decisive within their borders. Frankly, that is a vision that's incompatible with American values and our Constitution. What I am saying is that we need to confront the fact that our adversaries have an approach that considers control of information an essential component of their overall domestic as well as offensive, defensive, and offensive strategies. We have not only failed to recognize this situation over the last 2 decades, but we particularly tended to downplay and minimize the dangers of information operations. truth is, the 2016 presidential campaign served as a wake-up call for cyber attacks and information operations. Now, people keep warning, today being December 7th, of a digital Pearl Harbor or a digital 9/11, as if there will be a single act that will wake the country and make us take action on these issues. But I think I know, and I think many of you in this room know as well, we're already living those events on a daily basis. Simply look at the 2017 NotPetya attack. In the United States, we treated that as a one-day news story that was way below the flare. The truth is, the cost of that one single attack was more than $10 billion. This is the most costly and devastating cybersecurity attack in modern history, but most Americans have no idea that it even occurred. The true cost of our cyber vulnerabilities and the true cost of those attacks won't come with a single event. They will be gradual and accumulated. Our personal, corporate, and government data is being bled from every network every day. Our faith in our institutions and our tolerance for one another is being eroded by misinformation. This is leaving us exposed as individuals and vulnerable as a country. It's time that we dramatically shift how we view these threats. I hope the ideas that I've laid out today will help move us towards the comprehensive cyber doctrine and disinformation doctrine that we so desperately need in these challenging times. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Senator, for that enormously rich and fulsome these issues, and for outlining a doctrine for these things. There were some controversial things in. I'm going to start with one aspect, which is the use of offensive operations in the cyber realm. Yourself pointed out that on the one hand, our adversaries have not paid much of a price, but on the other hand, turning out the lights in Moscow might get turned out in New York with far more catastrophic consequences. Talk a little bit more about a judicious and appropriate use of offensive cyber, including what lessons we can draw from old-style deterrence in terms of the signaling you can do before you get to use these weapons.
Well, let's back up for a moment. So why I feel like we've been reluctant to use these capabilities. Let's face it, our nation is more technologically advanced, particularly over the last 30 to 40 years. Some of that technological advantage vis-a-vis China is being more and more equalized. So consequently, I think it was understandable that policymakers were afraid of cyber escalation because the amount of devices, connections that could be brought down if we entered into the cyber domain was much tougher on our end than potentially our adversaries. And so consequently, I think our adversaries have thought they could steal with impunity. I think about the OPM hack, and that we had extraordinarily high levels of attribution before we would respond. If we had a consensus around cyber norms, and we had agreement on an international basis that you don't turn off somebody's water system
right.
or an electric grid, I think that we could then put on that our advocacy, at least in-kind type offensive capabilities for us. Now, defining that in a way so that it's not, the analogy is often made to nuclear where, mutually assured destruction is not where I'm necessarily headed. Adversaries have known that we've not been willing to use these tools. I think we could only respond in alternative, has made us more vulnerable. So you almost need the international before you can start using, because you need that general agreement that say, if you go into these certain actions, potentially offensive, and that offensive can be on various gradations. It doesn't have to be tit for tat, but we have some of the tools to penetrate our adversaries' networks just as they do with us.
A little bit complicated, though. Even as we want to work with allies, we don't want to give up our own sovereignty to some collective hope of a normative regime, right?
But it also begs the question as, do you extend, and this is where I think, I don't have a position, but I think it needs to be thought, do you extend the shared defense commitments in the traditional military domain into the cyber domain?
Right. One more from me, then we'll go to the audience. You were pretty clear. Only going to work, the kind of doctrine you've called for, with a whole of society, and particularly with strong presidential leadership. We know where we are now, that some aspects, whereas the administration, as you outlined, has taken some strong steps and put out some strong documents and done some retaliatory work, the president himself is somewhat ambivalent in what's fake news and what's not fake news.
That's a gratuitous, or that is a generous description.
I'm a recovering diplomat. I'd like to see, in terms of leadership from the president and his cabinet on these issues, obviously outlined. But if we're going to have cyber hygiene as a nation alliance and public education campaign that you call for, what would you like to see from the White House now?
Well, first of all, I think it would start with an acknowledgement from this White House that the attack in 2016 was comprehensive, that it weaponized information, manipulated social media, that it touched our at least 21 of our states' electoral systems, and his still refusal to fully acknowledge really disrupts and undermines some of the very good people in his administration who are trying to fight this battle. No one in the Trump administration in the intel or defense world doesn't acknowledge what happened in 2016. But the fact that the head of our government still it's hard to get those words out of his mouth is a real problem and a real challenge to many Americans about the seriousness of this threat, number one. Number two, the fact that eliminated the senior person on cybersecurity sent absolutely the opposite message to both government and to society at large. Number three, in a normal administration, in a normal world, after we had a foreign nation attack our basic election system the way the Russians did, in a normal administration, because of the nature of our election system, federal, state, local, the only entity that could really bring about increased would be presidential or White House leadership. At least it didn't happen. There's some good folks at DHS that have tried, so the responsibilities actually fall into Congress. Senator Langford and Senator Klobuchar has got very good legislation, broadly bipartisan, that would ensure that if states wouldn't force states, but would ensure that if states wanted to get federal dollars around election, you got to have a paper trail. You got to be willing to audit the elections after the fact. That the three companies that have control 90% of all the voter files and some of the equipment manufacturing ought to at least have some independent ability to analyze to make sure they don't have malware. Now, that would normally be done by a White House, but again, you have a president that refuses to acknowledge this problem, and it makes it much, much tougher to get to the results we need.
Questions from the audience? Please wait for the microphone to come around to you and tell us who you are before you ask your question. Woman here in the red.
Hi, thank you for having this event, Senator. Maggie Miller with Inside Cyber Security. You were just mentioning the Secure Elections Act. Oh, is this not on?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
You were just mentioning the Secure Elections Act, which I know has been unable to go through Congress, this particular Congress. What have you heard from leadership next year, and do you think this could happen in the next few months?
We will renew our efforts. I don't make political predictions that often, but I bet if this bill got to the floor, it would get at least 80 votes in the Senate. And with the Democrats taking control of the House, it will clearly pass the House. The objection has come from the White House, and we simply, what I would hate to have is some where we see foreign, doesn't have to be Russian because the playbook is now out to use as well, where we see an intervention that forces us to act. This is responsible. And quite honestly, the vast majority of elections, some of the most conservative states who are reluctant to have any kind of federal intervention, the vast majority have now recognized the problem and I think would welcome the help and welcome the assistance. There's really, in the election system, there's the voter file, there's the voting machines, and then the computation process. We've made particularly, I think, progress at the voting machine level, but even there, this is all voluntary. So DHS has got its Albert system monitoring, but if a local registrar said, no, I don't want the DHS system, I want to hire my brother-in-law, who's got a little IT shop, they can still do that. We'll not prohibit that, but we would make the federal funds, Secure Election Acts would make the federal funds contingent on some kind of basic good hygiene standards.
Jim Miller here in the front.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Thanks for being here today. I'm Jim Miller. I'm on the Board of Advisors for CNS, proud to be, former Secretary of Defense, and interested in these issues, and a constituent. I want to ask two quick questions. One is a clarification. You noted that the United States should not engage in the same restriction of information as Russia or China. I wanted to ask you to confirm that when you talk about us turning up the dial for misinformation and disinformation, you're talking about our countering of that activity, not to turn the dial up for the United States. I'm confident that's what you believe. I want to make sure that's just on the record.
Absolutely. This is about having the capability both on a DoD and IC side to counter malicious efforts, whether by Russia, China, or other foreign actors, in their interference in America. And quite honestly, to be able to at least collaborate with our allies as well and learn from our allies, where I mentioned Finland, the same situation in Sweden, where they had elections and their civic literacies, digital, I think there are lessons we can learn.
Thank you. And then the question is, you talked about the need for strategic guidance and coordination at the national level at the White House. You were active in creating a broadening of authorities for the Department of Defense so that a broader range would be considered traditional military activities, which I think is very valuable. And and do we need an operational capability, a day-to-day national command and control element for cyber along the lines of what someone in DoD would call a joint interagency task force?
Short answer is, I'm not sure. I think we are still, as we still go through the discussion since I've been in Congress, do you split NSA and Cyber Command? How do you separate the two? The line between the two operations is blurred. I mean, the notion that everything either falls into a defense or offense capability is a really fuzzy line here. So I think this is something we need your expertise, we need others' expertise to kind of sort through. I think the takeaway on potentially in terms of potential use of offense as well as the message we need to send, there has to be clarity, and I think you start with the international norms that says if you country do X and we violate, and it falls into a category where it violates an agreed upon international norm, I would argue there might be then lower standards of attribution for us to respond. the willingness to at least take out or disable some of those operators. That doesn't mean you actually have to respond in kind in terms of turning off a power system, but it does mean you might be more aggressive at disabling some of their cyber operations. And it obviously should leave the whole field of other options through the White House and DoD to do. I do think the idea, and this is where I commend the Trump administration, where they've at least moved some of this decision-making from simply at the presidential level down at least to the DoD level. I think that's smart.
I think we have time for one more. Then we have to. Okay, great. Gentleman here in the blue. Right here. Right here. Yep.
Thank you, Senator Sean Lingus with Cyberscoop. I wanted to talk a little bit about the post-2018 election security environment. We learned this week that the NRCC had a breach to email accounts with officials within the party. That took place much earlier this year, and we're only learning about it now. I'm wondering, A, if that should have been made public sooner out of transparency, or if by contrast, making that public would have showed some sort of undermined confidence somehow in the process, how you feel about that. And then more generally, given that that was a revelation that came out this week, should we have an after-action public disclosure report from the administration on the election security measures, what worked and what didn't?
Let me take those in reverse order. My committee's leadership will be receiving that kind of after-action brief. My hope would be after we received it to see as much as possible if we could share it with the balance of Congress and where possible share it with the public, number one. Number two, in terms of I think you raised a good question on the NRCC breach, but it begs two things. One, it begs the continued failure in 2018 to have any data breach notification standards, or the fact that we've got 49 different laws and there's no standard. So whether it's NRCC or whether it's Marriott or the host of other breaches that take place, the fact that there is no standard notification, I think is a hole and a flaw. And I think in many ways what the Russians did, not only NRCC, but we saw it with the attempted penetration of Cyber that as the Russians or the bad guys get better as we get better. So we may be tightening and strengthening our election security, but one of the most vulnerable places are the major political committees, but even more vulnerable than the committees are campaigns. The ultimate startup is a political campaign, and the notion that cybersecurity is going to be on the top three when your goal is getting reelected or electing someone isn't going to take place. And I know while I think we can for the most part celebrate at least what we know now in terms of our success in 2018. What I see in 2020, the kind of the worst case scenario, is this merger between cyber and misinformation, disinformation. And the example I'd cite is when you have a foreign entity that would hack a repository of personal information, an Equifax, where then the foreign entity has your mother's maiden name, your social security number, and contacts you with information that you think must be secure because it's got all this personal information, and you open up and you don't get a post that says it's from Victoria Nuland. What you get is her image and words coming out of her mouth with deep fake technology that takes the next generation misinformation combined with sophisticated cyber. You talk about the ability to wreak havoc. It probably won't even play out. It may play out in a political circumstance, but just the effect it could have on the markets. If everybody popped up on Wall Street and got a message from Jay Powell talking about changing interest rates that was not Jay Powell, you'd have chaos in the markets. And we are not fully prepared for that. Let me take one last question, then I'll...
Third time.
Ma'am, right here.
Third time's a charm, Senator.
All right.
Ma'am, right here. Right here.
Trudy Rubin, the Philadelphia Inquirer. I wonder if you could say a word about systemic attacks. You were saying there wouldn't be a single attack, but how do you prepare for attacks attacks on electricity grids, attacks on Wall Street, attacks on systems that combine public and private. If you can't even protect new weapon systems that are vulnerable to attack, how do you even prepare for a potential systemic attack that could shut a country down?
Great question. Well, you start with the low-hanging fruit. My fear, and the power grid, the electric systems in our country, they have done a better job than virtually any other industry. They and the financial sector have done a great job. My concern is they put all of these sophisticated systems in place about the actual power generation, but the surface vulnerability dramatically increases when in the cafeteria, in the control room, the microwave is now IoT connected, and the ability to get in through that device, and we've seen examples like this of whether it's plumbing systems or other systems, and the fact that we don't have minimum security standards on IoT devices. We're at about 12 billion devices now purchased that are not secure for the most part. We're going to purchase another 20 billion in the next 10 years. It's insanity. And frankly, that some of the industry they're doing this just because they don't want to spend that extra few cents, and we're literally only talking few cents about putting in de minimis security. So we start with the vulnerability. Second, I want to reiterate this point. We have been waiting for the catastrophic cyber Pearl Harbor or cyber 9/11. If you take away nothing else from my speech today, take away the point that we are living this on a slow bleed basis every day. And to a degree, it is the responsibility of both industry and government to be more forthcoming about these breaks. This is where the idea of having within the corporate structure people who have better understanding of cyber. It means as well, I think, the intelligence community needs to be more willing to declassify some of the type and nature of the attack, so that people are on more alert, so that we're not going to stop everything and have 100% success, but we can gear up our day-to-day defenses rather than waiting for that single catastrophic event. And one of the areas that I've been looking at is that let's take the three areas where we probably had the best protections: the power grid, finance, and telecom. But one of the things I've started convening are meetings between those industries, because even if you protect your specific network, if they take down your bank, if they take down your power grid, you've got to communicate with the grid, with the financial sector, and if at the seams we don't have interoperability protection, we're really in a challenge part. And this is again where, while I am not aware of the particulars about the arrest of the Huawei official in Canada, and I want to see the evidence and concerns about. I do have concerns about the idea that business leaders across the world may be suddenly at risk, and you get into a tit for tat in that arena. I am very concerned about the lack of recognition that as we move into 5G, we've never had a time in my lifetime when around technology standards they've not been set by Western, either by America or by Western entities. But with the increasing ability of China to both sell its technology cheap and invest in many countries, many of these standard setting are done by international bodies where volume overcomes size of your particular economy, and this is a real threat in terms of companies like Huawei and ZTE. And while I applauded the administration, particularly when it took on ZTE, it was pretty discouraging that it only took one pushback from President Xi before the administration crumbled.
Senator, what a rich discussion we've had today. We want to thank you for being with us. I want to ask the audience to stay with us for our follow-on panel of CNAS experts. But first, join me in thanking Senator Warner for being with us. Thank you. Thank you.
Folks, for those of you who are going to be sticking around, we're just going to take 2 minutes to turn the stage, and we're going to bring some of our experts up on stage here.